It was a typical rush hour day on the Long Island Railroad train. People were getting home from work, but then a man pulled out a pistol and started firing indiscriminately into the crowds. The crime and the subsequent trial of Colin Ferguson was one of the strangest ever seen in the United States. December the 7th, 1993. Colin Ferguson purchased a ticket for the eastbound train and boarded a Flatbush Avenue, Brooklyn. He sat on the third car along with more than 80 passengers, but Colin Ferguson was not like the rest of the commuters heading home after a day of busy work. Colin Ferguson was born in 1958 in Kingston, Jamaica. He was the son of a wealthy pharmacist, one of the country's most prominent businessmen. His school principal described him as a well-rounded student. He played cricket and soccer, graduating in the top third of his class. When Colin Ferguson was 20 years old, his father was killed in a plane crash. His mother died from cancer a short time afterwards. The family lost its fortune, and the two deaths in quick succession had a big impact on Colin. He moved to the United States in 1982 on a visitor's visa, but he found himself in a country where he could only get menial jobs. He blamed racism for this. Marrying a US resident in 1986, he moved to Long Island. He and his wife Audrey often fought. By 1988, they were divorced. Audrey's friends said that Ferguson was too angry and antagonistic. After sustaining an injury at his clerical job, Ferguson enrolled in a community college. He transferred later to Adelphi University in Garden City. There, he became more politically active. He lambasted black people's coexistence with white people. He made frequent calls for revolution. Ferguson also falsely accused a number of people of racism. Eventually, he was suspended. By 1991, Ferguson was poor and unemployed, living in Flatbush. Neighbors said he had delusions of grandeur, believing that only white people were holding him back. In 1992, he had several run-ins with the law and finally won a settlement for his earlier work-based injury. After a brief stint trying to find work in California, where he bought a gun, he moved back to New York. He seemed even more disjointed than before, and frequently muttered to himself about race-based revolutions and conflicts. Eventually, his landlord asked him to move out. On December the 7th, 1993, Colin Ferguson boarded a train. It would be his last journey. Colin Ferguson rode the train with a Ruger P89 in his pocket and a canvas bag filled with additional rounds. He had 160 rounds stashed away. His head was filled with accusations of racism and revenge. The train approached Merillion Avenue station. Before he could stop, as people were standing to exit, Colin Ferguson drew the pistol. Several cartridges spilled onto the ground, the noise lost amid the general hubbub of the crowd. Ferguson took aim and pulled the trigger. Again and again. He fired into the crowd, spending 3 minutes shooting at anything that moved. At first, people mistook the gunshots for fireworks. But then a woman shouted, "He's got a gun!" People started to panic. They ran, but the train was not yet in the station. There was nowhere to go. Space cleared around Ferguson. He strode forward down the train, firing his gun every half a second. Passengers who found themselves stuck on the train tried to hide under the seats. Others fled down the length of the train. They tried to enter the next car, hammering on the door. Anyone who came too close to Ferguson got shot. Each time he reached a new victim, he looked them briefly in the eye, then he opened fire. "I'm going to get you," he yelled, again and again as the air grew thick with the smell of cordite and panic. In the other carriages, the passengers did not know what was happening until the train came to a stop. When the door opened, the passengers from Ferguson's carriage spilled out onto the platform. 2 people were injured in the stampede. The train still had not come to a complete stop. When the conductor realized what had happened, he had a choice: open the doors or not. Not every carriage was at the platform. The passengers in Colin Ferguson's carriage would be able to escape, but the rest would be sitting ducks. He chose not to open the doors. Noticing the panic, the engineer climbed out of a window and forcibly opened each of the carriage doors from the outside. Panicking passengers rushed past him. Meanwhile, Colin Ferguson was reloading. While he was focused on his gun, someone yelled, "Grab him!" 3 passengers, Michael O'Connor, Kevin Blum, and Mark McGinty, jumped at Ferguson and wrestled him into one of the seats. They would later meet the president, who commended them for their heroism. Soon, other passengers joined. They pinned down each of his limbs, making sure he couldn't move. Ferguson, knowing he was trapped, began to plead with the passengers. "Oh God," he cried, "what did I do? What did I do? I deserve whatever I get." Outside the station, an off-duty cop named Andrew Roderick noticed the commotion. He was supposed to be picking up his wife. He ran inside the station, straight to the train. While the passengers held down Ferguson, Roderick placed him under arrest. By that time, 6 people were dead and 19 more had been injured. The investigation that followed the LIRR shooting was brief, though the resulting trial was something of a sensation. Investigators determined that Ferguson had spent little more than a week planning the attack. Ferguson's calmness as he sat in the police car was also remarked upon. He seemed eerily unemotional, barely aware of the world around him. His pockets were filled with scraps of paper covered in handwritten notes about racial injustices. Those who questioned him described him as lucid and clear and aware, though he showed no remorse. When he was arraigned, Ferguson entered a no plea. Colin Ferguson's appointed attorney was a man named Anthony J. Falanger. Falanger began to arrange for an insanity defence, though it would be difficult to secure. Ferguson was placed on suicide watch. Within a week, he fired Falanger and replaced him with Colin A. Moore. Moore tried to have the trial moved to Brooklyn and, a short time later, withdrew his representation. Ferguson was again happy with the dismissal of the lawyer. He felt Moore had lacked integrity. By January the 5th, Ferguson had no lawyer and had been declared sane enough to stand trial. The grand jury indictment carried the possibility of 175 years behind bars. By March, Ferguson was represented by two new attorneys, William Kunstler and Ron Kuby. They worked for free, claiming that Ferguson had been made out to be a monster by the media. After they made numerous appearances on TV, the judge issued a gagging order. Meanwhile, Ferguson was incarcerated. While inside, he claimed the correction officers had beaten him and deprived him of necessities. On March the 23rd, Ferguson was attacked by a group of inmates. They broke his nose and left him with severe bruising. Prison guards deliberately showed Colin Ferguson any newspaper article which argued for him to be executed. Colin Ferguson and his lawyers claimed that he was being harassed. Ferguson's lawyers were putting together a strange case. They argued that Ferguson had been driven to insanity by racism. They labelled the term Black Rage. Around this time, Ferguson began to deny he had carried out the shootings at all. He told people he was receiving messages from God. But when his lawyers petitioned again to have him declared insane, Ferguson fired them. He insisted that he hadn't been involved in the shootings. He insisted that it was a conspiracy. He rejected the Black Rage defence. He chose to represent himself. The trial was broadcast across America. During the trial, Ferguson cross-examined police officers and even his own victims. He argued that he had brought the gun onto the train, but had fallen asleep. Someone else had grabbed the gun and started killing people. He spoke of one witness, Raul Diaz, who claimed to have seen an Oriental man implant a chip on Ferguson's head before the attack. Diaz was not called to the stand. Throughout the trial, Colin Ferguson referred to himself in the third person. He even tried to call Bill Clinton as a defence witness. Ferguson, at one stage, even wanted to question himself on the witness stand, but he failed. Despite Ferguson's best efforts, the jury found him guilty. On February the 17th, 1995, he was convicted on all accounts. He received 315 years and 8 months. Colin Ferguson remains in prison to this day. The trial became something of a national sensation. After the horror of the attacks, the absurd defence Ferguson put on was mocked on shows like Saturday Night Live. In the space of a few years, Colin Ferguson went from being a nobody to a monster to a joke. Which of those labels is true, however, remains uncertain.